Many years ago, there was an exclusive boarding school in England that had a scout troop. The leader of the scout troop was a teacher, and one weekend per month, he would take the scouts on a camping trip. There was one young boy in the scout troop who was very disobedient and disruptive. His name was Stanley Jenkins, and he was always getting up to mischief. No matter how many times the teacher told him off, he would never listen. One weekend, the scouts went camping in the English countryside. They got permission to set up camp on a farmer's land. The spot was on a ridge overlooking a deep valley. The teacher warned the boys not to go off wandering on their own, and told them that under no circumstances were they allowed to go down into the valley. While the teacher and the other scouts were pitching the tents, Stanley Jenkins and his friends were sitting around in the grass. They were too lazy to help set up camp. Instead, they went looking for some kind of mischief they could get up to. As Stanley Jenkins gazed down into the valley, he noticed a field that was surrounded by a barbed wire fence. At one corner of the field, there was an old stone well. It looked like the field was never used, and it was overgrown with weeds and brambles. Just then, they saw the farmer who owned the land coming with his dog. As he passed by, Stanley Jenkins waved at him, and the farmer stopped to talk. Stanley Jenkins asked, "What's in that field down there?" "The one with the well inside it." The farmer replied, "That's the wishing well. But you're not allowed to go down there. I hope your teacher told you that." Stanley Jenkins said, "Wishing well? You mean if you throw some money into the well, you can make a wish?" The farmer let out a grim laugh, and he said, "I wouldn't know. That's what they call it. But nobody around here goes near the wishing well. In all the years I've lived here, I've never set foot in that field." Stanley Jenkins asked, "What's the matter with it?" Farmer replied, "All I know is the cows and the sheep keep away from it. Even my old dog wouldn't go through that field, and neither should you boys, if you've got a brain in your heads. They say it's haunted." "Haunted?" Stanley Judkins scoffed. "Haunted by who?" "3 women and a man," said the farmer gravely. "Who are they?" asked Stanley Jenkins. "It all happened before my time," said the farmer. "But I was told they died in the well, and they were found dead in it. I saw them once. It was twilight, and I was standing on this very ridge. My old dog saw them too. They came out of the bushes and went crawling around. 4 of them. Just black rags and white bones. It seemed as if I could hear their bones clacking as they moved. I couldn't make out their faces. All I could see was their teeth." The boys let out a collective gasp. Stanley Jenkins chuckled. "What happened then?" he asked. "I don't know," said the farmer. "My old dog took off running, and I took off running after him. So take my advice, boys. Steer clear of that wishing well if you know what's good for you." With that, the farmer tipped his hat and walked off. The boys stared after him. The next evening, the teacher gathered the scouts and did a head count. He noticed one of the boys was missing. After doing a roll call, he discovered that the missing boy was Stanley Jenkins. None of the other scouts seemed to have any idea where he was. Then one boy spoke up. "Maybe he went down to the wishing well, sir." The teacher's face went pale. "The wishing well?" He gasped. "But you were all given strict instructions not to go down there." The scouts followed the teacher as he walked up to the top of the ridge and looked down into the valley below. The light was fading, and it was getting cold, but there wasn't a breath of wind in the air. "Can anyone see him?" the teacher asked. "There he is," said one of the boys, "getting over the barbed wire fence. Do you see him?" "Yes, it's him," said another boy. "I recognize his sweater. Now he's making his way towards the wishing well." "That little idiot," the teacher growled. At that moment, one of the boys let out a high-pitched scream and covered his eyes. "What's that black thing on the path?" cried another boy. "Crawling on all 4s. It's a woman. Oh God, don't let me look at her." "Stop it," the teacher said loudly. "Get a hold of yourselves. I'm going down there. Hancock and Fartleby, you run to the farmer's house and call for help. The rest of you boys stay here and don't move." The teacher ran off, leaving the boys alone on the ridge, staring down at the field below. To their horror, they saw another black figure emerge from the bushes. Then another and another. They saw Stanley Jenkins making his way towards the wishing well. He didn't seem to notice the black figures approaching him, shuffling forward with their arms outstretched. The boys started yelling as loud as they could, trying to warn him. As he reached the wishing well, Stanley Jenkins seemed to hear their cries. He suddenly stopped and turned around. Then he let out a scream more piercing and dreadful than any of the boys on the ridge, but it was too late. The black figures closed in on him until he was surrounded on all sides. Then they pounced. The boys stared at the scene below in a terrified silence. They could hardly breathe as they watched the horrific struggle. The hood of one of the figures fell back, revealing a white skull with stringy wisps of hair. Their gnarled, bony fingers were ripping and tearing at Stanley Jenkins, and soon his awful screaming ceased. The boys spotted their teacher running towards the field. He scrambled through the barbed wire fence, but then he stopped and wouldn't go any further. The farmer arrived with a number of policemen. The boys pointed down at the field below and screamed, "They got him! They got him!" over and over again. The policemen ran down into the valley. The headmaster arrived, and all of the boys were transported back to the school. Some of them were so traumatized that they later left the school. The teacher stayed there with the police all night. The next morning, they found what was left of Stanley Jenkins at the bottom of the wishing well. He had been torn to pieces. His parents came to collect the remains. The farmer put up another barbed wire fence encircling the field and erected large signs with "Danger" and "Keep Out" written in large red letters. Locals in the area say that the field is now haunted by 5 ghostly black figures, 3 women, a man, and a young boy. The sentry boxes in San Cristobal were built in 1634 and used by the Spanish soldiers to guard the city walls at night. Many of the sentry boxes were quite isolated and lonely, and at night the guards would shout out to each other in their boxes to make sure everything was okay. But there was one sentry box in which none of the soldiers wanted to spend the night. It was the most distant and lonely one, standing on a cliff in Fort San Cristobal, the oldest part of the fort's defenses. Guards who stayed there overnight told strange stories of eerie sounds and whispering voices they could hear in the still of the night. They said it sounded like evil spirits or demons were talking to each other. One night, it was the turn of a soldier named Sanchez to be the guard on duty there. Like every other night, the occasional shouts from one guard to another were heard, but nothing was heard from the sentry box that Sanchez was guarding. Whenever one of the other soldiers called to him, there was no reply. The other soldiers became worried during the rest of the night and trembled thinking about what may have happened to their friend. At sunrise, all went to check on Sanchez and found his sentry box empty. They found his rifle and his uniform, but Sanchez himself had vanished without a trace. Sanchez was just the first of many soldiers who would disappear from that sentry box in San Cristobal in the years that followed. Each time, when the soldiers went to check on their fellow guard, they would find nothing but his rifle and his uniform. No traces of the men were ever found, and their families never heard from them again. The mystery was never solved, and the San Cristobal sentry box came to be called the Devil's Sentry Box, because the soldiers all believed that their colleagues had been spirited away and devoured by the devil. A man was driving home from work one evening when he came to a railroad crossing. The traffic lights turned red, so he stopped the car in front of the tracks. He heard the bell ringing and saw the barrier slowly coming down. He glanced to his left and noticed a teenage schoolgirl hurrying down the sidewalk. When she saw the barrier coming down, she started running, trying to cross the tracks before the train came. Halfway across the railroad tracks, the girl suddenly stopped. Her foot was caught in a gap between the wooden slats and the metal rail. The train was approaching fast. The man watched in horror as the girl tried desperately to free her leg. He jumped out of his car and ran over to the barrier, waving his hands and shouting, attempting to warn the train driver. It was no use. The girl couldn't free herself and screamed out, "I don't want to die!" The man turned away and hid his eyes as the train thundered through the intersection. He cringed as he heard the girl's scream, suddenly cut off by the deafening clack-clack-clack of the train on the tracks. As the train roared off into the distance, he gingerly opened his eyes and forced himself to look. He braced himself for the terrible sight he was expecting to see, but the railroad tracks were completely empty. There was no sign of the girl's mangled body. There was no blood at all. He looked around, wondering what had happened to her. Where could she be? Did she manage to free herself in time? Just then, he noticed a small marble plaque on the wall between the barrier and the railroad tracks. It was surrounded by flowers and candles. The inscription on the plaque read, "In loving memory of our darling daughter who was taken from us much too soon. Rest in peace."